We've just finished a 5-part series on Christianity in the Pax Romana, leaving off with the story of Perpetua the Martyr, a Christian woman from Africa, a new convert to the faith, and a young mother who tragically died in the arena during the reign of the African emperor Septimius Severus. We talked a lot about Septimius Severus's rise to power and the first decade or so of his reign in episodes 59 and episode 60 of this podcast, and we now move into the definitive final years of his reign. Septimius was, in many respects, a transitionary figure. He kept the appearances of the Pax Romana, but it was evident to everybody that the fundamental workings of the empire had really begun to shift. The Roman economy was wilting under the weight of an increasingly militarized society, and Septimius, almost through sheer fiat, was doing all that he could to keep the system alive. Would he be successful? We'll talk about that on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 65, The Death of Septimius Severus. Folks, I just want to thank you for listening to the podcast and remind you that if you haven't already, check out my YouTube channel. I've just started it, so there are only a few videos up, but I will be posting snippets of lectures from my university classroom. At the moment, these are focused on the Roman Republic. In other words, material that dates just before the Pax Romana. This week, I will probably post a review of the film Gladiator II, assuming that I can get some time off during the Thanksgiving week to go and see it. Several of you have already watched those videos and commented and subscribed to the channel, and I thank you very much for doing that. And by the way, if you like this podcast, please do leave a rating, leave a comment. Let Spotify or Apple Music or whoever it is that you get your podcast from know that you enjoy this podcast. It certainly is a big help, and thank you very much for listening and for your support. Let's get to today's episode. Septimius Severus would rule the Roman Empire for almost 2 decades, from AD 193 to 211. The story of Perpetua, which we talked about on the last episode, occurred right in the middle in the year 202. Perpetua actually died in games meant to celebrate Septimius's birthday in North Africa. As you may remember from previous episodes, Septimius was originally from that area. And we know that Septimius had 2 sons. His oldest, Lucius Septimius Bassianus, who we tend to call Caracalla, a nickname that refers to a type of tunic that he wore. He was born in AD 188, and then the next year, Caracalla's younger brother was born in AD 189. His name was Publius Septimius Geta. Septimius's family were great sources of pride for him and especially important in his ideology and propaganda. After all, there had been a period of civil war and dynastic uncertainty. It was vital that Septimius Severus show that he was establishing a new permanent order in the Roman Empire. And so around the time that Caracalla was made co-emperor, coins are minted advertising one happy family. We see, for example, a gold aureus minted in the year 201, showing Septimius Severus on one side and the 2 boys on the other side, with an inscription reading in English, "Everlasting Rule." Another coin, also gold, minted just a year later, looks almost identical, except now Septimius Severus's wife, Julia Domna, is placed in between the image of the 2 boys, and the inscription reads, "Felicitas Seculi," which we might translate as "a blessed age." In other words, because the family was strong and the dynasty secure in the 2 boys and a fertile wife, the reign of these Severans was not going to end with Septimius Severus. This was going to be a long-lasting imperial family. As we'll see, of course, in the next few episodes, there will be some problems with that plan. One of the things that caused problems right away is that the 2 brothers did not like each other. And this will be something that we will come back to in the story. Caracalla, though, was the older brother. And when he was just 10 years old in AD 198, a year after Septimius Severus had successfully beaten his final rivals for power in the Roman Empire and had won sole control over everything, it was then that Septimius appointed his younger son Caracalla, just 10 years old, to rule with him as full co-emperor. Never in Roman history had a person so young been given the full formal power of a Roman emperor, but times were rapidly changing. And Septimius, as an emperor who rose to power in the midst of a coup, likely feared one himself, and it was vital that he put a successor in place as soon as possible. And so it makes sense that just a year after Septimius won the civil war, he puts his son, it doesn't matter that he's just 10 years old, in an unassailable, very clear position as successor and indeed co-emperor. And as I alluded to in the introduction, it was also essential that Septimius continue to fight foreign wars. The whole basis of his power was the loyalty of his legions, and he had to keep them happy because just as those legions had turned on previous emperors in order to support Septimius, they very well could turn on him. Septimius knew the game. Pay the soldiers more money, become the new Roman emperor. And he didn't want anybody to do that. And so he was constantly finding ways for his soldiers to make more money and obtain more glory, to keep them satisfied with him as their commander. And the importance of appeasing the soldiers would only increase as the decades move on. And so not too long after a successful war in Parthia and then a successful war in his home territory of North Africa, Septimius turned to Britain. In AD 208, he went there with a massive army. The most likely reason Septimius chose Britain is because it was a hotbed of rebellion against him back when he was fighting civil wars. The would-be emperor Clodius Albinus, who had been a governor in Britain, had been the most significant threat to Septimius's power base, and it took a massive battle to defeat him. All of that anti-Severan sentiment in Britain did not simply evaporate, and in a sense it made sense for Septimius to go to Britain with a show of force. Even if he didn't intend to conquer a bunch of new territory, he needed to remind the people who did not support him initially that he was in fact in charge, and he would not tolerate any rebellion coming from that province. It was also true, however, that the British tribes around Hadrian's Wall, especially to the north, were a potential threat to the Roman part of the island of Great Britain. And so Septimius was also seeing to repairs along the forts along Hadrian's Wall and the restoration of the wall itself, as well as strategic buildings, including granaries where food could be stored in the event of protracted battles near the wall. Not long after Septimius arrived in Great Britain in 208, he took around 40,000 to 50,000 soldiers across Hadrian's Wall and into the north, Caledonia. And this was challenging territory for Roman soldiers. The terrain was rugged. Access to the ocean was limited. Roman infrastructure largely vanished compared to what was available in the south, and the climate was far harsher. Initially, Septimius was successful. He managed to retake the territory all the way up to the Antonine Wall, but he faced significant resistance from local tribes who used guerrilla tactics. The campaign ended up sucking resources and time from Septimius Severus. In addition to tens of thousands of soldiers and Septimius himself and his two sons and his wife, all of whom traveled to this part of the world together, leaving the rest of the Roman Empire to function without them, many senators and elites also traveled to the north of Great Britain, setting up shop in the Roman capital of Eboracum, which is where the modern city of York now stands. Beautiful city, by the way, if you haven't visited it. And while Septimius was up north of Hadrian's Wall, his family were there in Eboracum. Septimius never conquered the north of Great Britain. In fact, he didn't really make it that far, but he did accumulate enough territory in the first 2 years of the war that he went ahead and declared victory anyway. He took the title Britannicus, conqueror of Great Britain, and also bestowed that title upon his 2 sons as well, both of whom were there with him. In fact, it is likely the case that this is the reason that Septimius took them there, so that they could be physically present for the war and receive some of the loyalty of the soldiers in that way. In fact, Caracalla personally led soldiers to the north of the Antonine Wall, and he was especially brutal. Several of the tribes in that part of Great Britain had no interest in allying with the Romans in any capacity, and as far as Caracalla was concerned, that gave the Romans the right to just murder them outright in genocidal manner, men, women, and children. Any settlements or infrastructure that the emperor's soldiers came upon was destroyed. In the year 210, Septimius Severus' health began to decline precipitously. We're told from sources that he dealt with gout and was increasingly in pain, finding it difficult to stand and even to move. Near the end of his life, Septimius Severus became bedridden, and that's why Caracalla was off on his own in the year 210. The Senator Cassius Dio claims that in this condition, Caracalla actually attempted to murder his own father, but decided not to go through with it at the last minute. Supposedly, the whole family was gathered around Septimius when he died. Among the many things that he said to his sons, this one sticks out to me most. Quote, "Scorn all men, enrich the soldiers." Septimius knew that the key to power in the post-Pax Romana era was to keep the soldiers happy, and that the best way to keep the soldiers happy was to ensure that they had a regular supply of coin in their pockets. Septimius probably wanted his sons to rule together as co-emperors, perhaps even on the model of Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, only this time the brothers would not merely be adoptive brothers, but Caracalla and Geta, of course, were biological brothers, perhaps making their union stronger. But as I've already alluded to, the 2 young men absolutely detested each other. Their mother, Julia Domna, Septimius Severus's widow, attempted to keep the peace. Their advisors also sought to keep the 2 brothers unified. From our primary sources, Caracalla is the one that is portrayed as the most ambitious of the 2 brothers. Caracalla supposedly executed his father Septimius's doctors and many of the now deceased emperor's freedmen, suggesting distrust and the desire for Caracalla to consolidate power. Back in Rome, the imperial palace was physically divided to reflect the enmity and estrangement between the 2 brothers. Caracalla and Geta each had their own set of guards and servants, and their poor mother, Julia, would move between the 2 sections of the palace to meet with her children separately. On December 26, 211, the 2 brothers and their mother met for a rare family dinner together in person. We don't know exactly who put this meal together, whether it was the mother, whether it was one of the 2 brothers, but we know that it happened. And at some point during this dinner, a physical altercation ensued. We don't know who started it, but we do know who won it. Before the end of the night, the younger brother, Geta, was dead, supposedly breathing his last breaths in the arms of his mother, Julia Domna. Ancient sources tend to blame Caracalla, saying that he murdered his brother outright. Caracalla would claim, at least to his Praetorian Guard, that it was actually his younger brother Geta that tried to kill him, and that Caracalla was just acting in self-defense. But what's interesting is that just after the death of Geta, Caracalla initiated a purge, killing many of his younger brother's supporters in the Senate and in the government. The number of people killed was not in the dozens or even the hundreds, but perhaps in the thousands, if we can believe our ancient sources. But more than just the deaths was the damnation. Caracalla had his brother's memory condemned, meaning that all public depictions of Geta were to be destroyed, and his name was to be blotted out from any inscriptions. Also rounded up in this purge were any remaining descendants of the previous dynasty, the dynasty of Marcus Aurelius, the very dynasty that Caracalla supposedly had been adopted into through his father Septimius Severus's adoption. And to this day, we do find inscriptions where Geta's name has been removed. The most interesting artifact, in my view, is what is called the Severan Tondo, and you should look it up, the Severan Tondo. It's a circular wooden panel depicting the family of Septimius Severus. It was likely used as a form of imperial propaganda or veneration in private spaces, a painting on wood. All the members of the family, Septimius, his wife Julia Domna, and then his two sons, are depicted with scepters and wreaths symbolizing their imperial status. Septimius Severus, interestingly, on the Tondo, is shown with darker skin, reflecting the fact that he came from Libya. He was a North African emperor. But the reason that I find the Tondo interesting and why I tend to show it to my students is that the face of one of the two sons has been blotted out. And most historians think that this is the face of Geta, that whoever owned this wooden painting complied with the order to remove Geta's image even from this household souvenir. There is, however, a minority view about this image, that it's not actually Geta's face that has been blotted out, but Caracalla's. And the reason for this is something that I will get into on the next episode. Because Caracalla, as it turns out, when he became sole emperor after the murder of his brother, went on a violent rampage, and he made many enemies. But that is a story for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.